Alright, so this is part 2 of inverse functions, and in this video I'm just going to go over 3 examples of how to write an inverse function given the original function. So in the first video we talked about this idea of how can we use what we know about inverse operations to to write inverse functions. And the idea is that inverse operations undo the original operation. And an inverse function undoes the original function. So we're using the idea there of the inverse operations to help create these inverse functions. So let's go ahead and jump into our first example. So in this example, we have our function of x, and it's asking us to write the inverse function of f of x, which is 3/4 times x plus 6. So up here in the right hand corner, I have our order of operations that probably most of you are familiar with. And if we look at our function, we want to look at what is the order of operations, how we would evaluate this function if we plugged a number into x. So I'm going to go ahead and just write our function f of x right here. And I'm going to draw this line to indicate what our function is doing. So if we're looking at our function, we first have 3/4 times x. So 3/4 is some number, it's 0.75, but we have it written in fraction form here. So 3/4 is multiplying x, and then we're adding 6. So if we look at our order of operations, we first see that we have multiplication here. So the first thing that's happening is we're taking 3/4 and we're multiplying it by x. So we have multiplication, 3/4. And then secondly, our function is going to be adding 6. Okay, we're going to be adding 6. Alright, so if we wanted to undo what this function just did, which is the inverse function, first we can write it as our inverse function of x. Okay, now we just want to say, how can we undo what our function did? So our function first, or the last thing our function did was add 6. So we want to go in the reverse order and undo this. So if we lastly added 6, the first thing our function want to do for our inverse is undo that. So we want to subtract 6. Okay. And the first thing our function did was multiply by 3/4. So if we want to undo multiplication, we can use division. So that is the inverse operation of multiplication. So we want to divide by 3/4. Okay. So now, if I was to write our inverse function of x, let's go ahead and write that right here. We always start with our variable. In our case, our variable is x. And the first thing we want to do going this way is subtract 6 from x. So we take x and we subtract 6. Okay, so whatever that value is, we now want to divide that value by 3/4. So if we had x minus 6, we can now divide that whole value by 3/4. And here is our inverse function. So recapping, we just looked at what our function was doing, and then we thought, how can we undo each of these steps in the reverse order? And then we start with our variable, and then we just apply those operations onto x. If you want to, you can simplify this up a little bit more. I'm not going to do that in this video, but I'll just show you what it is, just in case if you worked it that far. You have 4 times x minus 6 divided by 3. If you're having trouble getting from here to here, go ahead and drop a comment in the comment section and I can help give some insight into how we get from that step to the next step. Alright, so in this next example, we have our function g of x, and it's asking us to write the inverse function for g of x. And this function g of x is x divided by 2 plus 6. So if we're looking at our order of operations, we can see that division comes before addition. So I'm going to go ahead and first write what is our function doing. So we have our function g of x. I'm going to draw this line. What is our function doing? So first, if we were to plug in some value into x, we would first divide by 2. So we first divide by 2. And secondly, in our function, we would be adding 6. Alright, so we know what our function does. Now, how can we undo what our function just did? So I'm going to start with my notation for the inverse function. And we want to go in the reverse order and undo what each of these steps that our function did. So well, the last thing our function did was add 6. So we want to undo the addition of 6. We can subtract 6. So the inverse operation of addition is subtraction. Secondly, if we want to undo the dividing by 2, division of 2, we can multiply by 2. Multiplication is the inverse operation of division. Okay, so now that I know what my function did and how I can undo each of those steps, it's as simple as writing the inverse of this function. So the inverse function, g of x, g inverse of x, we always start with our variable. Once again, our variable is x, and we just go this direction. And we perform these operations to x. So we first have x, and we're subtracting 6 from it. And then whatever x minus 6 is, we want to multiply that by 2. So x minus 6 is going to be grouped together. And we want to multiply that by 2. Okay, so this right here is our inverse function. Once again, the way we got there was we looked at what was our function doing. Now, how can I undo each of those steps in the reverse order? Okay, we got one more example here. Example 3 is write the inverse function of, this time, instead of f of x or g of x, we have y equals. So you can think of it the same way. So y equals x minus 4 divided by 2 plus 8. So the first thing we're doing here is we're taking x and we're subtracting 4. You might not see parentheses here, but parentheses just mean grouping symbols. So they're grouped together. So x minus 4, both of these terms, this whole quantity right here, is being divided by 2. So I put parentheses in here to show that x minus 4 is being grouped together and that whole quantity is being divided by 2. Okay, so if we want to write what our function is doing, once again I'm going to use a line here. And the first thing our function is doing is taking whatever value we have for x and subtracting 4. So the first thing our function is doing is we are subtracting 4. Okay, secondly, our equation, whatever x minus 4 is, that is being divided by 2. So the next thing our function is doing is we're dividing by 2. And lastly, we have this plus 8 on the end, so our equation would be adding 8 to whatever x minus 4 divided by 2 is. And there we go. So we know what our equation, our function is doing. Subtracting 4, dividing by 2, and then adding 8 to that. So if we wanted to then undo this, the way that we can write our notation here is just y inverse. Okay, and if we wanted to undo this, the last thing we did was add 8. So if we want to undo the addition of 8, we need to subtract 8. Alright, secondly, we divided by 2. If we want to undo that, we need to multiply by 2. And lastly, our function subtracted 4, so we need to add 4 to undo the subtraction of 4. Alright, and from here we just need to write our function here. So we always start with our variable and we move this direction. So we first subtract 8. So we would have x minus 8. And whatever x minus 8 is, we are then going to be multiplying that by 2. So I'm going to use these grouping symbols, parentheses, to show that x minus 8 is together and we're multiplying that by 2. Alright, and lastly, we need to add 4 to this whole group of terms. So we have plus 4 on the end here. So right here is our inverse function of y. And once again, we're using this idea of what is our function doing right here. And then it's as simple as using inverse operations to just undo that function and writing it out as an equation. So if you have any questions, please feel free to write in the comment section, and I can make videos based on what kind of questions you all are asking, and I can help you guys out.